It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off front page is loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 36 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a one-time supporter on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The websites will be in the description section of this podcast. Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining. I think I have most of my audio issues fixed, though it seems like there's a weird echo now, so that hasn't had before, almost like I need a sound dampener to absorb the echo, but I didn't have that before, but now it seems to be an issue, so I apologize for the technical issues ongoing again this week. Okay, so we're going to go over the three main articles I wrote this week. I always say main articles because I do write a few smaller articles in between as when something hits me and I want to go ahead and write out a quick 4,000 to 1,000 word paper. There's usually no audio to them. There's no videos. They're just short articles I write once in a while. So that's when I say main article. I mean the three that I make. I write, I do audio file, and then I do videos and video summaries for. So those are what I mean when I say main articles. So the first one is Ukraine trying to dictate Western foreign policy. Hey, Europe, the hand-wringing is getting old. And who cut the cable? All right, so we will start to talk about the Ukraine trying to dictate Western foreign policy. This comes out of the latest example, though I wouldn't say it's the first, but this is the latest example, and probably one of the most egregious examples was Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany requested a phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss the Ukraine war. The call was the first time since 2022 that the two have talked to discuss the Ukraine war. Now, prior to why this is so, this is something I've been talking about for a while, is the diplomatic isolation of Russia by the West, and what a dangerous practice it was. And this diplomatic isolation that I've written before several times actually starting around 2016, 2017, even prior to the election of the first election of President Trump. So this is something that's been going on for a while. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton tried to start what they call the Russian reset with that stupid reset red button she made Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, press in some news conference. Just a completely unserious gesture. And then John Kerry and some of who replaced Hillary Clinton, some of his policies. He's the one who invited the Russians into Syria, and then tried to dictate to the Russians. It was just overall just a bad. Then obviously, then we'll go into the 2016 election and the Russia hoax that continued for a long period. So anyway, the diplomatic isolation has been going on for quite some time. One party does it more than the other, but the other party in the U.S. also goes along with it. So this is not a good practice. And the one thing I've been arguing is ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Russians or the Soviet Union at the time and the United States had established a hotline that provided direct contact between the leaders of both countries. Well, that's all kind of gone away, and there's anybody that talks with a Russian is obviously, or even doesn't even come out as adequately hostile towards Russia are viewed under suspicion by political parties and by a toting media. So this is not a good state of affairs. Even at the highest points of the Cold War, again, the establishment of the hotline, diplomatic relations were maintained. And this now is practicing diplomatic isolation. Even when the countries weren't even talking at the high level, at the leadership level, there was low-level diplomatic contacts with each other's military and political leaders on both sides to make sure that there wasn't any type of they were gauging out the hostility between both sides and trying to stake out policy positions of both sides to determine the level of risk in diplomatic circles, because obviously they didn't want to misstep, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't want to misstep themselves into implementing their bipolar, because it was a bipolar world, you had the East and the West, by conducting their bipolar policies that could go too far and cause some type of issue or crisis between the two sides. So there's always levels of communication between the Soviet Union and later Russia and the United States. And that has basically gone away both at the high level and at the lower levels. And President Putin of Russia acknowledged that the West was participating in diplomatic isolation of Russia for quite some time, and that he, meaning Russia, is practicing a reciprocal diplomatic isolation with the West. Now, you got a biggest land war going on in Europe now, and they're neither side are talking to them. And both of them, well, you have Russia on one side, nuclear armed, United States, Great Britain, and France on another side, all nuclear armed. I'm sorry, North Korea is now a party involved in the Ukraine war, and they're nuclear armed. So you got a lot of nuclear armed adversaries in the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. And for the most part, they're not talking. So to his credit, Olaf Scholz did request to have a call with President Putin, and to his credit, he agreed. Now, there's a political implication for this, is because Olaf Scholz, he has also been one that has called for finding a way to end the war, a negotiated settlement to the war. He doesn't have a specific peace plan, but he believes that peace should be pursued with the hope of, I think he has the announced hope of 2025 as hoping to end the war or negotiate settlement, or at least a ceasefire to the war. Again, no specific peace plan, but a desire to find a way out of the war. They've also been the staunchest, probably even more so than the U.S., the staunchest opponent to Ukraine joining NATO while it's in war, which is actually the correct statement, because that's actually in the NATO bylaws. So there's nothing sinister about the Chancellor Scholz's position on Ukraine NATO membership at this time, because it's not possible. It's in the NATO rules themselves, and the only time those NATO rules can be changed is unanimously. So it is not possible for Ukraine to join NATO at this time while the war is going on. So he's been very upfront about that, and he's also been an advocate for trying to seek a way to press some way to get the war to come to a negotiated settlement. So the other side of Olaf Scholz's position, and this is something that I've argued that President Zelensky is not appreciating, is in the east part of Germany, Thuringia, I can't pronounce that, Thuringia and Saxony, which are two states in the eastern part of Germany, had state elections. And the Alternative for Germany Party, or known as AfD, often described as a far-right party. I guess it's far-right from the position of the mainstream German parties. There, I won't really go into this is a German issue, not an American issue, so I'm not going to go into the politics of AFD, but they do argue. Again, they throw labels around. I'm not buying into the label one way or another, but the label that they're pushing is far right party. But they do have a very hard stance on immigration, and they adopted a very hard stance on negotiating an end to the war. Well, in the two states, Thuringia and Saxony, the Chancellor Scholz's party, the SPD, Socialist Party of Germany's Socialist, it's SPD. I have to go back and look at the exact term. So his party took a significant beating in both those state elections. Where actually his party in Saxony finished in third and were clearly out of the majority. AFD had their best showing so far in the East, and in one of the states, they actually have a plurality. Neither one of them they have a majority, and even with the plurality, they don't have no party in Germany will work with them, so they don't really have power, but they have definitely gained support, and the support from AFD is one that is starting to drain. It looks like it is draining from Olaf Scholz's coalition, mainly the SPD. So the issue that he has is if he recently fired Minister Christian Lindner of the Free Democratic Party, FDP. That's why I get these the actual names of these parties confused. So the FDP, which was in a coalition government with Chancellor Scholz's SPD party, he was fired by Olaf Scholz, and basically it crumbled the coalition government as the Free Democratic Party basically withdrew from the coalition. So now, obviously, Chancellor Scholz is still in position as the chancellor, but it's a minority government, and snap elections have been called for February 23rd, 2025. So Chancellor Scholz has to go up for election. Now, I'm getting to the whole thing about the phone call here. So Olaf Scholz is coming up for elections. He just took a beating in Thuringia and Saxony, and he's not. And it wasn't just came in second. His coalition was thoroughly beaten. He needs to shore up the SPD to be able to be more competitive in the East if he has any hope of maintaining power in the after the snap election. Even that's kind of questionable, but he's got to act out politically. So without going into AFD politics, that is his primary rival in the East that took away much of the support that SPD had in the East. Again, AFD has always been popular in the eastern part of the country, but he has to find a way to try to win some of the mainline supporters that may have gone to normally would have voted for SPD to basically pull out of the AFD or withdraw their support from the AFD. So he has to pursue, as a part of domestic politics, knowing that the AFD is arguing for immigration reform, or basically the stopping of immigration into the country, and their other secondary issue is ending the war in Ukraine or ending support for the war in Ukraine. So he has to be able, Chancellor Scholz has to be able to shore up himself politically in the domestic arena. So he has to find some way to blunt AFD's position on, in this case, the Ukraine war. So if his primary rival, the one that he needs to pull some of their support from, he has to take a position that he's trying to find an end to the war, or at least showing a willingness to talk to Ukraine's enemy, Russia, to find a way to end the war. Now, the phone call that he had with Chancellor Scholz, the call that he had with President Putin, Chancellor Scholz basically came out and said that the phone call, and this came in during the call and during the clarification after the call, is he is not reducing support for Ukraine at all. He asked that Russia withdraw its forces from occupied Ukraine and start this peace talks. This is not Germany calling to surrender to Russia or giving anything in. He's just saying a desire to seek peace, asking that the Russians withdraw from the country. Now, unrealistic request, but he did have, you've got to start with the conversation. You at least got to start what your position is, and then you kind of go into how you negotiate those positions from, think of it as meeting in the middle. The President Putin, for his sake, says that Ukraine needs to recognize the new reality on the ground, which is the occupied territories that Russia occupies now, which is about 18% of pre-2014 Ukraine, Russia occupies. So he basically said they're not going to, President Putin says Ukraine has to recognize that they will not get those territories back. And then he also stated that Ukraine had to stay neutral, meaning no NATO membership. Now, that means the Russian side staked out their position, the German side staked out their position. There was no giving in or abandonment of support of Ukraine. In fact, it was very specific that Chancellor Scholz was not going to back off on supporting Ukraine. He doesn't support NATO membership at this time, but it's not a case where he says, meaning Chancellor Scholz, does not state that Ukraine can never be part of NATO. It just can't be part of NATO in the current circumstances. The country can't be at war, and it cannot have territorial disputes, both of which exist in Ukraine. Also, you have to have democratic processes. All elections have been suspended in Ukraine. So there's three factors in that point that Ukraine can't join NATO. But he's just stating they can't be part of NATO at this time. He's not backing off support. He will not allow German weapons at this time to be used against targets inside Russia, outside of the eastern extreme of around Kharkiv, where the Russians had directed a summer offensive towards. He did authorize that German weapons could be used in limited support in targets inside Russia, just on the opposite side of Kharkiv, which I guess was basically the territories between all the way to the original Russian border, all the way to Belgorod in Russia. So again, not giving in any position, but trying to show in my opinion, is a demonstration to the German voting population that he is taking steps to try to find a way to end the war. But he's doing so without giving in to any of President Putin's demands. So this is just what foreign policy is. He has to do this from the political perspective of trying to maintain power inside Germany, and that means he has to be able to try to blunt one of the political positions of AfD. So this is just politics. But President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I'll back up one other thing, put a context around this. Germany is the number 2 supporter of Ukraine. They provide number 2 in weapons and number 2 or 3 in financial support, but overall are number 2 behind the United States. This is one of the most important supporters of President Zelensky in Ukraine. And as I stated in all those above, this is about party politics inside Germany and trying to shore up his political position inside Germany for the snap elections in February 23rd, 2025. He did not give anything to the Russians. He just wanted to talk to them. President Putin heard the German position, Chancellor Schultz heard the Russian position. Nobody gave in on anything, but they staked out their positions. That's part of diplomacy. If you're going to find a way out of the war, both sides stake their points, and then they start negotiating from there. That was established. There was nothing earth-shattering. There was no turning their back on Ukraine. But President Zelensky criticized quite harshly Chancellor Schultz for what he said, opening the Pandora's box by calling President Putin and undermining the ongoing efforts to diplomatically isolate Russia. And this is one of those things that there's two factors here that that President Zelensky doesn't understand. And again, I'll also go in there, is that Chancellor Schultz made this as he wanted a just and lasting peace. That was basically his theme coming out of that call with President Putin. Okay, so Zelensky says that opening a Pandora's box by ongoing efforts to diplomatically isolate Russia. If you want to negotiate an end to this war, it has to require a diplomatic discussion with Russia. And he knows that. He's even talked about when he failed at his Swiss peace conference and that ridiculous 10-point peace plan, which was more of a dictation than a peace plan. He realized after that meeting in the Swiss as well that you couldn't have peace talks without Russia. That means you have to talk to Russia. You have to have your allies. If you can't contact Russia directly, which is probably not a good point for neither side of those ties, maybe at this point to be talking directly without an intermediary, which I've talked about before. It's like India seems like the most likely intermediary at this time. So you have to have diplomatically isolate Russia. That diplomatic isolation of Russia has to end. And as I said earlier, is President Putin is reciprocally responding to the West as well by by basically diplomatically isolating the West. Now, if you want to end the war, and Chancellor Schultz is wanting to end the war, he has stated that publicly. He wants a negotiated settlement to the war, but he has to do this again for political politics. You have to have diplomatic contact. So he's not acting. Germany probably can never act as a intermediary for the war because they do provide more support to Ukraine than any other country outside the United States. And also, for that factor alone, Russia cannot accept them. And Chancellor Schultz is not talking about reducing that aid to the Ukrainians. There is some reduction in aid, but it's because the EU basically, or the G7 basically arranged for a loan from seized or frozen financial assets in the West that were, as part of sanctions, were frozen in the West. Those are still gathering interest, and there was a loan written on the interest point of, I can't remember exactly how many tens of billions of euros. Germany is lowering their some of their economic aid to Ukraine that roughly matches what Germany's portion would have been that's going to be covered by that 50 billion or so euro loan. So they are kind of what but he's not talking about reducing anything more than that. And with that loan, and we can go into, I wrote about that, about some of the legality around that loan. He's not talking about reducing the amount of aid to Ukraine, but that did not stop Zelensky from attacking him pretty significantly and very publicly. So the President Zelensky's aid was, to me, it was actually surprising, and it was unwise. Again, as I talked about, he's the number 2 provider of aid. He's not giving in anything to the Russians. He did not throw Ukraine under the bus, but he gets attacked publicly. Your number 2 provider of aid, who's trying to save his political ass in Germany and taking the steps necessary to keep his position or his party's position, even if he's not the chancellor, to be able to strengthen his point, to be able to blunt the advances of AfD, he has to do these steps. And so it was just very short-sighted of President Zelensky to do this. Now, maybe President Zelensky has forgotten about politics because he's basically he's past his term. He's not running for election. He's permanently, as martial law stands, he's permanently in power as president. He doesn't have to play politics, but he should know that because he did run for election, and he knows that you have to balance the interests between the different parts of Ukraine. There's Ukrainian Russians in the east, which is a problematic area, which is mainly occupied by the Russians now. You've got the ethnic Ukrainians, but then you go into ones that are have ethnic connections to the Polish and the Hungarians and the Romanians. So he understands the idea of having to talk to different political interest groups, and that's just talking about ethnic groups that have different political views. Then you got to go in within the views of all those all those groups. There's subgroups of you could just call them conservatives and liberals in that. He understood this, but just to criticize Germany. In fact, you could criticize Germany in private, but he chose to do it very much publicly for breaking the diplomatic isolation for Russia, the Pandora's box. If that's what the view is a Pandora's box, that Pandora's box needs to be open if there's going to be any chance to find a settlement to end this war. And it's not going to be won by force of arms through Ukraine alone. They don't have the strength to do that. It's unfortunate, and it's not attacking the Ukrainians. The average Ukrainian person did not ask for this invasion, and I could even say that probably based on January 2022, all the way up to the invasion in February 2022, President Zelensky was trying to tamp down the threat of Russian invasion because he wanted to find a way to keep it from happening. Even when the U.S. warned him that it was coming, he was still trying to deny I think he called it rumor mongering. So he understands that you have to have diplomatic relations with Russia. He's even talked about it that if they wanted to have a new peace plan, this is before he came up with this Ukrainian victory plan that has no way out to actually seeking peace. But after the Swiss peace conference, he did discuss the failures of that conference. He just discussed, and in the Swiss also, is any peace talk in the future has to include the Russians. So he knows diplomatically it has to be done. And to sit there and attack your number two supporter, what does that say to other countries that are in the West that are supporting Ukraine but have some issues of war fatigue, and they have to be able to have the ability to maneuver to maintain their positions in politics? Are they going to be afraid that somehow they're going to cross President Zelensky and they're going to get blasted in public? Or is it like, do they cut aid to the Ukrainians? Probably not. But if they're not able to maneuver within their own political parties and their own political environments that give them some say-so in politics without the threat of being criticized publicly by the Ukrainians, is highly unwise by President Zelensky. Because what if one of those parties, I'm not talking about the United States here, but one of those parties in Europe says, we don't like the fact that our foreign policy is being dictated by Ukraine, so maybe we need to stop supporting Ukraine so much. I'm not saying that's what it should be, but you go into political parties and you have these political debates inside those countries. This is not helping. President Zelensky's got to understand that if his partners are still offering to provide the right amount of aid, they have the freedom to discuss as sovereign nations, to have discussions with Russia, knowing that ultimately to end the war, you have to have diplomatic, you have to stop diplomatically isolating Russia. And he knows that because he admitted that was a problem with the Swiss peace conference. It is just absolutely ridiculous. And then he did something very similar to the South Koreans, saying that they needed to step up more when the North Koreans went ahead, moved into involvement in the Ukraine war around Kursk. They haven't crossed into actual Ukraine yet, but they're fighting Ukrainian forces. Not sure exactly how heavily engaged they are, but they are engaged. and they have taken casualties. So this criticism that you have to, if you're not 100% in with what President Zelensky's view of at that particular time is, somehow you are disloyal, or you have to basically sign over your foreign policy as a sovereign nation over to whatever President Zelensky wants, otherwise he publicly criticizes you. He should stay out of the business of telling other countries what their foreign policies and what diplomatic connections they maintain. That is just, it's absolutely unwise, and it was just dumb. Again, to criticize your second highest provider, who went into the call and very specifically told the Russians that they needed to withdraw from Ukraine and start peace talks, and that he wasn't going to give up on any of the aid to the Ukrainians. It was absolutely foolhardy, and I just think it was just a absolutely dumbfounding, absolute disrespect for allies. But President Zelensky, I know he's got to be under a tremendous amount of stress in that country. But he's been making a lot of unwise decisions by trying to insert himself into almost getting to the point where he's inserting himself into how foreign policy should be conducted among its allies, and also how domestic policy should be involved. I know that in the United States we had issues with President Obama getting involved in both the vote on Brexit and also on Israeli elections, and that was wrong as well. If they are sovereign countries that are running democratically run campaigns, the U.S. doesn't have any say-so in it, just as much as Ukraine doesn't have say-so in a sovereign state's diplomatic arena. You can disagree. You can take those disagreements in private. You can even make them public. But if they're not, again, like Germany was not giving in to any of the Russian positions, and it was not throwing Ukraine under the bus. It was just absolutely unwise, and probably has strengthened the opponents of Chancellor Scholz inside Germany. So it's just an absolutely unwise decision by President Zelensky. All right, so hey, Europe, the hand wringing is getting old. So this is coming over to more of the hand wringing and pearl clutching and near panic in Europe, where I think they've had 3 summits to discuss Donald Trump becoming president, and their concern over tariffs are part of it, but they're absolutely just over emotional response to the election, to the U.S. election, because of statements that, going back to statements that then President Trump stated in 2017. So the context of this is in 2014, as you know, Russia invaded Ukraine, seized the Crimea, and then basically started direct support of the separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, which are now largely occupied. So after that 2014 invasion, and there was a previous incursion into the Georgia Republic as well by Russia, basically NATO said they had enough. They saw Russia now as a threat. So they made the decision in 2014, in response to the seizure of Crimea by Russia, to require that all countries in NATO give 2% of their GDP to dedicated to defense. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but actually it's actually quite a bit of money for most countries. It could be higher, but it seems like a modest increase that is something less than a joke. So this is, if countries spent 2% of their GDP after the end of the Cold War, there would be substantial military capability inside NATO. So that's where this comes from, is that there is a requirement of the 2% GDP since 2014 due to the original invasion of Ukraine to seize Crimea by Russia. Every country in NATO agreed to it. The only way this could have been NATO policy is if every country in NATO agreed to it. Every one of them. And every country that came in after 2014, I think there's 4 or 6 nations. I know the latest ones were Sweden and Finland, or Finland and Sweden, North Macedonia, Montenegro. I think there might have been one other one. When they signed up for NATO, they came to the same agreement that, yeah, they weren't there when the agreement was made, but the condition of being a member of NATO was assuming that 2% GDP target as being a member of NATO. So everybody collectively agreed to us. 100% agreement, 2% of GDP. Everybody 100% agrees to it. And nearly everybody ignored it. The United States followed it. Great Britain followed it, or United Kingdom followed it. And Greece followed it. Those are the ones credited with NATO as spending 2% or more of their GDP on defense every year for the 11 years that this agreement has been in force. So there's only 3 countries that have followed this. Now, also, Finland and Sweden are the newest members. They're actually in agreement. Both their budgets increased above 2% just prior to becoming NATO members. So they knew that they had to increase defense spending, so they honored those agreements. So of the 11 years, in fact, only 3 countries have given. I was looking at some data. United Kingdom is kind of in some of their spending is in gray zones where some of the defense spending, they don't count as defense spending, but NATO does count it as defense spending. So you'll see something like in 2018, I think Great Britain shows on their defense budget as 1.89% of GDP spent on defense. NATO shows them being over 2%. That's about, there is policies in place where they designate what is defense spending and what isn't defense spending. So there's just a matter of interpretation where the reported numbers coming out from the defense, the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom said, no, we're not at 2%, but NATO said, no, actually you are. And I think it had something to do with payments towards, I think what it was pensions, I believe, was coming up as a discussion. So anyway, there is some debates on that, but as NATO sees the rules, and in a document printed by NATO that I used for this article, they say that the 3 countries that have given every single year are, again, United States, United Kingdom, and Greece. Now, I think that the U.S., by nature of its position, having to maintain defense on both sides, obviously we know that there's a lot going on in the South China Sea and the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. has security commitments on both sides of the world, in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. So naturally, the U.S. is going to spend more than 2% of its GDP, and it does, because the U.S. is right around that 3% mark, not including what they spend on the VA. But that doesn't include towards NATO rules for. But the United States is always above 3%. So going through the numbers to say, okay, the point is 2% of GDP, everybody agreed to it. In 2017, President Trump went to the NATO summit, and there's a famous picture where he's talking and at a table, and all the European leaders are standing around him, just leaning forward, just mad. They're just big mad over this, is where he called them out on their lack of defense spending. And they're getting angry over it. But it's like, you agreed to this. Every one of the countries, 100% agreement that they would spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending. And they are just mad that he's calling them out on something they committed to. And the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has actually come out and said, he was actually right. You need to spend more on defense spending. So Mark Rutte is much more diplomatic, not as straightforward as President Trump and President-elect Trump, but they're in the same position that if you agreed to spend 2% on GDP, there's an actual, in NATO's view, and we can debate that part, is there is an existential threat from Russia on the continent. Obviously, they're involved in a war in Ukraine. NATO views this as a threat, and they've viewed this threat for 11 years. And again, they basically did nothing. So now you go into the numbers. So let's just go into their numbers. And this is what some NATO members are trying to equivocate themselves, that they are in compliance. So they look at the numbers that are reported out by NATO. And you look at the numbers, and you look at every 10 years, for every year since, or the 11 years that this has been in force since 2014, as a collective measure, NATO has been above 2% GDP every year. But that's not the agreement. The agreement is every country, every member nation will spend 2%. But they're going in there and looking at, we're actually at 2% as an organization. Every year since this has happened, defense spending rose after 2014, and we've been right there every year. We're there. But then you go back and look, is that when you remove the United States from that number, they have failed to meet the 2% target every year but 2024, when it is 2.02% of GDP, outside of, not including the United States. So this is a case where they are, even when they go in there and say, okay, we're actually meeting it, is, well, the position is, well, the U.S. is out of the equation. You're not meeting your commitment. Your commitment. Again, let's make this very clear. Everybody in NATO agreed to this goal. So in 2024, there finally is a lot of pressure, and this is probably part of the NATO Secretary Generals have been pushing to get the numbers higher, because even after the invasion, you have seen defense budgets have doubled since the invasion, and it's just starting to show in the numbers now this year, where you're actually seeing some significant progress on meeting the goal. So once you cut out the United States, Europe, NATO, Europe, and Canada has finally been over 2% as a collective. In 2024, 24 of 31 nations are meeting the spending target, or 77% participation, in something that was supposed to be 100% of participation for the last 11 years. There are, as a side note, there are 32 NATO nations, but Iceland does not have an armed forces, so they do not have a requirement to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. They are mainly member of NATO because of their geographic position in what they presumed as the need for the use of air bases for the North Atlantic and closing the North Atlantic gap. Also, you had the issues of Russian or Soviet submarines coming in through the gaps between the United States, Greenland, Iceland, and UK. So that's why he speaks of the geographic position of Iceland was important. So they're a member of NATO, but don't actually have any armed forces. So they are excluded from the 2% requirement. So 24, 31 nations finally have met it in 2024, or 77% participation rate, in something that was agreed upon to be 100% participation rate in 2014. So pat yourself on the back, but also pat yourself on the amount of failure. So, and I found this funny, is that French President Macron's call for Europe's defense to be independent of the United States. He is tired of, especially he did not like President Trump. But then again, most European leaders did not, and they probably will not again. But President Macron of France advocated for a defense independent Europe that doesn't rely on the U.S. for security because it chaps his ass that the U.S. is the biggest provider of security in Europe. Oh, he hates it. So he's arguing for a new European security order modeled after Gaullism. I've written about this before. France will be the leader of defense in Europe. Now, this is actually, there's some good points that President Macron is making. He has been pushing for a defense independent Europe. He does not like Europeans spending money in Europe on buying U.S. weapons. He doesn't like the idea that the U.S. is the backbone of security inside Europe. He thinks Europe should be protecting Europe. And there is a point to that. Now, so there are some things that he does align with President Trump on. And he has been very critical of the United States, and even under President Biden. So it's not just a criticality of Trump. He does not like President Biden either. So he's been pushing for this, and he wants to be France to be the leader inside Europe to provide security. France is a nuclear power, and France has been very much aggressive since about 2023. They were actually pretty quiet through all of 2022 and a good portion of 2023, but the second half of 2023, they came out, President Macron came out very hawkish against the Russians in the Ukraine war, to the point that he sent 1,500 troops to Ukraine outside of the main war zone, but he did send French Foreign Legionnaires there. So you think, okay, France is speaking up. They want security. They want to be the leader. Okay. France has only fulfilled the GDP commitment twice in 11 years, in 2020 and 2024. So, okay, so they want to be a leader in security, but they're definitely not leading the way on this. Now, the question around that is that one of the criticisms I've had of Germany is that the way Germany demobilized after the Cold War was basically just, we'll call it just neglected the armed services, neglected the industrial base to produce the weapons. The French have been, or I would say to their credit, have been much more thoughtful of how they started pulling back from defense spending. They basically shrunk their armed forces without neglecting their armed forces. That's why you find the French are considerably smaller than what they used to be, but they still have a manufacturing base to make weapons. They also have armed forces that aren't starving of every piece of equipment like you see in Germany or in Canada. So the French were, I think, much more, took a much smarter approach to their after Cold War and how they spent the peace dividend, and it didn't equal neglect of their armed forces. So give credit for President Macron, but also saying that the person who is pushing to get the U.S. out of security in Europe, and so that France can be the leader and fill the void of when the United States leaves, is not meeting its commitment either. So I thought just, when I saw that, I was like, okay, well, France is going to keep up with it. No, twice in 11 years, they're keeping up with the agreement. So went into this, I'm sorry. So recently, President Trump and Secretary Rutte have publicly stated that Europe should increase its defense spending. Basically, Rutte and Trump do agree on the need to increase spending. And it just comes into how one says it very directly, one says it very diplomatically. So here's some of the numbers. So European NATO countries and Canada need to spend on their 2% GDP target goal. I wrote earlier, Germany, Italy, and Spain have the largest deficits because it's not only the fact that you have to spend 2%. When you don't spend that level, and I talked about just briefly with France, they were spending less money, but the way they basically draw down their forces, they didn't do it through neglect, where Germany, Italy, and Spain have done it through a neglectful process. And so now they have a deficit that they need to make up. And I wrote about this earlier, is in another paper from the IFO Institute in Munich, basically came out and says that many European countries have deficit in defense spending because they neglected their militaries for so long. So when you go in there, they'll talk about the 11 years, and you go in there and you place, well, when these countries weren't in NATO at the time, now they are, and all the countries that originally agreed to it. So when you put that all together on a grid, the NATO document actually does have all that on there. I just made all the calculations myself. NATO, including the U.S., has only been 27% compliant rate. So when you go in there and say every year, and you plot everybody's GDP spending, and when they were a member of NATO, and you come up with all those points, 27% compliance rate as of 2024 in all those occurrences that happened between 2014 and 2024. So you go in there and say, okay, 27% compliance. You go prior to 2022, it's 19%. 19% compliance rate on something that 100% of NATO countries agreed to. 27% after the Ukraine war, 19% before the Ukraine war, and now we're getting up to 2024. If you take 2024 standalone, it's 77%. The most ever that's ever met the target, but 77% out of 100% that agreed to do this. So this is the fact that Europe gets mad at President Trump, a little less so at Secretary General Ruda. They have not met their commitments. And they said they get mad when they get called out on it. Now, here's some of the issues that it has with this, is this public criticism that they don't like. Okay, the fact is they agree to it. Let's go back to it. 100% agreement that you would do this. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine, 19% compliance when you look at when you plot the points out for every year. So one of the challenges that they have is NATO lacks a mechanism to enforce adherence to the 2% GDP target, and it shows. When you go in there and it's saying all these countries, all these European NATO countries and Canada all agree to this number and ignore it from the start. It's all just show. And the thing is, when it comes to military operations, it's not a show. You got to come. You have to come ready. Otherwise, you get the consequences are significant. So the countries go in there and they agree to it. So we're going to spend more on the defense, and they completely ignore it. Again, going back there is the United States, Greece, and the United Kingdom have met their commitment every year. Poland has actually the biggest defense increase in NATO as a percent of GDP than any other nations, but it also has not met every year that it's been a member of NATO either. But it is definitely trying to make up a lot of ground right now. Now, the problem is, you have no mechanism to enforce adherence to this 2% GDP target. And that's the problem. So obviously these countries in NATO do not feel that they have to honor their commitments. They can complain when they get called out for not meeting their commitments, but basically they don't have to do it. They just have okay, what are you going to do? So very undiplomatically, President Trump does the one thing, and President Ruda agrees with it. The only thing they can do is they can just publicly call them out, shame them, make reminders, threaten, like, okay, we're going to leave NATO, or, well, why would you want, should we bother even defending you if you're not meeting the 2% GDP target? And the other question is, so that's a real issue. But the problem is you cannot create a situation that you'll force some type of mechanism to make countries pay because NATO has a unanimous consent requirement. So any rule, like any country that says, okay, I'll just throw out the country that's not given, Canada. So Canada could just say, no, we're not going to go through any enforcement mechanism, veto. Okay? You don't get it. So it all just takes one country to stop it. So they know they can't create an enforcement mechanism because with 27% compliance rate after the Ukraine war, start of the Ukraine war, and 19% before it, obviously majority of countries in NATO do not want to have anything that makes them honor their commitments. So the other thing is make questions like, why do you want to be in NATO if you're not willing to spend the amount of money that's required for collective defense? And maybe you need to be called out of being, like, this sounds harsh, but being a free rider. You want all the security and defense of NATO, but you don't want to give in to defense, to spend on defense. And again, this isn't a goal that says, okay, every country needs to spend 100 billion euros on defense. It is proportional to your GDP. So it's not even like, okay, well, the big countries have to spend, they can easily afford this. It's proportional. Yes, the big countries in Europe, the big economies in Europe are going to have to pay more, but everybody's paying a same proportional amount. So the question is, like, if you can't even meet that 2% GDP target, should there be some type, like, what you should be publicly questioned? Why do you want to be in NATO? Have those uncomfortable diplomatic conversations. Maybe their populations don't want to be in NATO. Maybe the fact of having to spend 2% GDP is abhorrent to the local population. Then why do they want to be in NATO? Because if they're so abhorrent to spending amount on defense, what is the likelihood that they're going to come and honor a NATO Article 5 commitment? It really does need to be questioned. Now, I'm not talking about throwing anybody out. And actually, I'm generally a supporter of NATO. But I also think that there has to be some type of way to question these countries that don't want to support it, because it feels like a lot of free lunch going around right now. And the fact that there needs to probably be some more European countries calling other European countries out, and Canada. So the other option they could go into and say, well, if you can't pay your 2%, maybe somebody like the EU has to get involved and says, okay, all the countries that are in the EU, you need to give 2% of your GDP. And if you can't, there will be transfer payments that every country pays a tax into the EU, and then the EU distributes out that money to make sure everybody gets up to a 2% GDP target. That will make a lot of countries inside the EU mad. And again, you run into an issue with the EU is there has to be 100% unanimous consent. So it's one of those cases where even this would be very hard to do, but it would be a way for the European Union to make sure that all its NATO members come up at a 2% GDP. And it also would, by doing that, it would most likely undercut any chance of the EU trying to create its own army. Because if it comes up and says, okay, all our nations in the EU are spending less than 2% of GDP, maybe we need to create our own military to cover that gap. So again, the European Union is not a member of NATO, but a majority of EU countries are a member of NATO, and that NATO is required for the protection of the EU. So there's almost like this symbiotic relationship between the two. The other issue is, well, maybe the EU can come up with some type of rule that doesn't receive unanimous consent like they've done with, let's say, immigration. Right now, everybody, I've wrote about this several times, is Hungary is in a butting heads battle with EU over immigration and is being sued and fined by the EU. Well, what the EU adopted the 2% target and started suing or fining member states for not meeting their 2% GDP requirement. Now, this would only apply to EU countries. But what if the EU takes sanctions on non-EU countries? And this could also include the United States could be involved in the sanction process. Sanction NATO countries that don't spend their 2% GDP target until they actually get into compliance. Sounds really harsh because you don't really want to sanction your allies, but since there's no inside NATO compliance process, how can NATO countries operate outside NATO to force compliance, or just mainly just see if they want to quit? That's a possibility too. So here's an example. Like here's some non-EU countries. Obviously, you've got United States, Albania, Canada, Iceland, Montenegro. I think Norway is also not a member of the EU. So those would be countries that could face pressure from the EU or the United States to comply with NATO standards. So those are just some of the ideas. But again, it is a matter of, it's basically just a case of hurt feelings. And the fact that because there is no mechanism, the only way that President Trump and now Mark Rutte has even talked about is that you have to publicly call out these countries. You have to publicly shame them. You have to even make threats of, okay, well, maybe we don't protect countries through Article 5 that don't comply to the agreement to spend 2%. Again, reminder of everybody agreed to it. And that is the biggest problem with all this hand-wringing in Europe and over NATO. The United States views Europe as part of the United States' national interest. Now, does Europe view the United States as part of its national interest? Okay. If the United States was removed from Europe, would Europe view the United States as part of its vital interests? Most likely, because they would still require the United States to protect the sea lanes in the Pacific Ocean region. Maybe, but it is also of direct interest to the United States that especially after 2 world wars in Europe, it is an interest of the United States that there is a safe or a free Europe that is a friendly democratic region. So I would say that Europe is in the national interest of the United States. United States to Europe is also a natural or it's not a national organization, all of Europe, but for most countries in Europe, it is of their security interest to have the United States involved in European affairs and security. This is kind of my thoughts on that, but that's really what it comes down to, is that the European countries that are complaining and not wanting to be shamed about not spending what they agreed upon, they really do not have a leg to stand on. Maybe they don't like to be publicly called up, but that's because there's no mechanism to enforce 2% GDP compliance. So that's why this is all going into, and just the fact that if I can figure that out, these people in Europe, these leaders in Europe can figure out as well. So the fact that they just have summits to worry about it and discuss it, if you just paid 2%, you would find the whole argument would go away. But they don't want to go, they rather argue about the problem than just come up with the solution, which is right there in their face. Spend what you agreed upon, and the issue goes away. It's not that hard. And so there's probably more political capital to sit there and talk about the bad Americans than to talk about, to try to convince your people that, yeah, we need to spend more on defense that they may not like. And again, your leaders in those countries agreed to it. So it is just absolutely ridiculous. Find a way to get to your targets, and the whole thing goes away. Not have summit after summit to see what we're going to do. Yeah, even Mark Rutte says, spend more. That will get you that will fix the problem. It's just ridiculous. It's just, they're supposed to be smarter than us. Certainly smarter than me. And it's just like, this is, again, am I oversimplifying this? Yeah, I know budgets are issues, and everybody's got priorities. But if defense spending is not your priority, they could have, at the time, vetoed the 2% GDP target. And it would never have been an issue. But they agreed to it. And they'll say, well, that was a prior government. Okay, well, find some way to bring it back up to a vote in NATO or drop yourself out of NATO. It's, again, you come up with this agreement and you come up with this, and then all of a sudden you get offended when President-elect Trump, then President Trump, or now Secretary Ruta calls you out on it. So they're much more gentler on Ruta because he's one of their own. He is also a very able diplomat, and he handles these things in a diplomatic issue. But you listen to them, they're saying the exact same thing. Just one's European and one's a little bit nicer in their tone. So, all right. So who cut the cable? So this is a case where 2 undersea data cables were cut this week. Now this is it was reported, but it kind of been swept under the rug because of some of the release of weapons by the U.S. to ATACMS to be able to attack targets deep inside Russia. So this kind of got missed in the story, the news cycle of the week, and kind of call it a below the fold type story. So 2 undersea cables were cut in the Baltic Sea on November 16th and 17th. And there is a suspected Chinese ship that was, through tracking software, was in the exact locations at the exact same time when the cables are cut. Very strong circumstantial evidence that the Chinese were involved in this. Doesn't mean the Chinese government, but that a Chinese ship, a Chinese asset was involved in it. So now it's a question of, okay, why, and was there actually some Chinese involvement in it? So the cables ran from, it was called the BCS East-West cable that ran from Lithuania to Sweden. And the other one was the Sea Lion 1 cable that ran from Finland to Germany. Those were the 2 cables that were cut. The first one was, I think it was the BCS East-West was the first one cut. So European and officials believe that, now in the context of what's going on, is European and U.S. officials believe that Russia is responsible for hybrid attacks in Europe in response to their support of the war against war in Ukraine. Now, we've talked about these red lines over and over again. Is like NATO, Russia creates a red line, NATO crosses it, and they say, "Hey, see, Russia's not doing anything about it. Their red lines are fake. There's nothing to them." And then when Russia doesn't respond directly, but you start looking in the world and see all the stuff that's gone on since every time a red line is crossed, the world is becoming more and more unstable. And a lot of this is caused, I'm going to say a majority of it is caused by decisions that the Russians have made in response to Western support of Ukraine. I'm not saying one way or another that this war in Ukraine is, that the support for Ukraine in this war is necessarily unjust. I will go back to it. The Ukrainian people in themselves did not ask for this war. I will argue that I've said this many times, is the Ukraine war has been an international disaster. It has been something that Western leaders have absolutely failed at. Ukraine political leaders have absolutely failed at. And I will put it in, the fact is, Russia did not need to invade. There was not a security situation anywhere in the world that Russia needed to invade Ukraine. They probably thought it was going to be a fast, quick, easy operation in and out, and they toppled the pro-Western government in Ukraine, and the whole thing's over with. But again, this has been screwed up by every party involved, and the factors, I feel sorry for those. I feel significantly bad for all the civilians, most of them, vast majority of them, Ukrainians that have been killed, wounded, and displaced in this war that they didn't ask for. So I will go in there and I will make that point. But so as these red lines are crossed, is yes, you see, yeah, Russia hasn't necessarily responded, and we'll talk about the attack this or the couple days ago. We'll talk about that briefly, but it's not part of this article. So there's been a number of hybrid attacks that have happened. You've got Russia pushing migrants up to allowing basically migrants to pass through Russia, and so that Russia can push them to the NATO border, mainly along Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Also looking less so in Eastern Europe, because a lot of those Eastern European countries aren't really playing with that. They basically just turn them away, even despite some of the EU rules. So, and then there's been fires, there's been, you have diplomatic isolation going on. I talked about that earlier. You've got UN activities going on to thwart initiatives in the United Nations that had previously been agreed for. For example, Russia supported sanctions against North Korea over its nuclear program and nuclear proliferation in response to the West crossing the red lines and the fact that North Korea was willing and able to provide artillery ammunition to Russia. All of a sudden, Russia's no longer supporting sanctions against North Korea. Basically killed it in the UN Security Council. Basically killed all the nuclear and missile sanctions against North Korea just by the fact that it vetoed all the, not necessarily the sanctions, but the sanctions monitoring, which has to come up for a vote every year. So there's been many things like have occurred. I think what was the one about streetlights in Finland had their computer chips taken, and now they suspect that they were used for Russian weapons. But it's basically been, then you got cyber warfare going on. So you have a type of hybrid warfare going on. And that also includes, hybrid warfare also includes political interference. So you kind of go into the political disinformation and election interference, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So those are also included in what NATO and including the U.S. have been accusing Russia of participating in. Again, this is part of those red lines. As the NATO and the U.S. cross over to another red line, Russia doesn't necessarily respond directly, but they will respond, let's call it, obliquely to this. And when you start looking at the totality of what's going on, yeah, the world is a much more unstable place. So hybrid warfare, as I said, includes political interference and election interference as well. Disinformation. So you got political interference, including interference in election and disinformation campaigns. Now this kind of goes back into a little bit talking about the Russia argument of 2017 and beyond. Is in a free political society is you're going to have political discourse, and you're going to have influencing activities, and you could possibly have disinformation campaigns. So, for example, we'll go back to the AfD. They are ones that want to end the war in Ukraine and want to end German support for that war. Okay, that seems like legitimate political discourse. You may not like the AfD, but that seems like political discourse. Is that being considered as disinformation, or is that being considered part of political discourse? Are they saying the AfD is being paid by the Russians, or the fact are they giving moral comfort to the Russians by taking a political position as part of legitimate political discourse? That's one of the issues with hybrid warfare is what is in a relatively free Western society with elections and free press, though a lot of press in Europe is also supported by the state. But having the idea of having political discourse, having a difference in opinion, presenting a different opinion in the media or on social media or books or just campaign appearances? Is that disinformation because it goes against the narrative of the state? So that's one of the issues with hybrid warfare. What is true? The idea of hybrid warfare is valid, but there's these gray areas that you go in there and say, what is really truly political interference and what is influencing activities such as disinformation campaigns? How is it separated from political discourse and difference of opinion that are allowed in societies that have free speech and free elections? How do you separate those two? That's a very hard thing to do in a free or relatively free society. Again, not saying that they're illegitimate concerns, but how do you sit there and say, yes, that is hybrid warfare because you are taking the Russian position, when a person or a politician may be really feeling that that's their position, and they have no interest in promoting, in this case, the Russian cause or the Ukrainian cause. So again, just because it's presented in a narrative that is contrary to what the state is saying and their foreign policy is set up, that doesn't mean it's disinformation. So how, in a hybrid warfare situation, how do you differentiate between what is discourse and what is political interference? Or again, what's political discourse and what's disinformation? Because there is a fine line between the two, especially as the world gets more and more. You're seeing the world become more and more bipolarized. I know the Chinese refuse to say it's bipolar. They want multipolarization. President Putin says it is a bipolar world, just like East and West of the Cold War era. The politics are also inside the West, inside the countries that have free election. You're also starting to see more hardened positions where you're not seeing so much in the center, or what used to be the political center is now defined as the hard right, as neither side are willing to negotiate between the gaps of their political positions. So that's the one issue with hybrid warfare. So we can go on across, in this case, the one that really stands out for hybrid warfare is sabotage. There were cable lines cut. And so going into the more narrow part of hybrid warfare, and one that people can agree on, is sabotage. So was the cutting of these cables, was this sabotage or was this an accident? It seems pretty clear that the Chinese ship, I think the Yi Peng 3 is the name of it. It's a Chinese flag bulk carrier. It does look like it was involved in cutting the cables. So the question is, was this intentional and was this not intentional? Now, I'll kind of go back a little bit more about motivations here, but it does show that the data from Europe shows that the Yipeng 3 was in the exact location at the exact time that each cable was cut. So there's very good circumstantial evidence. Actually, it's even below that, above that, there's actual data. Again, not observation, but there is data that the Yipeng 3 was in the exact location of both cuttings of both cables. So that's been confirmed by Swedish and Finnish officials. I think the Germans have also confirmed it as well. The Finnish and Swedish are treating this as a law enforcement investigation, so most of the information that is coming out of Europe over this is coming from the Swedish and the Finnish side. So the Finns and the Swedes, as part of this law enforcement investigation, they have said that the cutting of the lines were deliberate. That means it's sabotage. That means it's hybrid warfare. Now, the U.S. officials are saying they're not so sure. They could be an accident. Now, the cutting of data cables and gas pipelines, I did briefly mention the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the paper, but the cutting of cables does occur, but it is very rare to occur. So it doesn't happen that often. U.S. officials are saying, no, this could be just very well be an accident. And so they're using some circumstantial evidence to say, Well, they can't prove that the Yipeng 3 is working for the Chinese government. So why would they do this? Is because we can't find a connection to it. Now, the Europeans, again, Finnish and Swedes, they do believe it was deliberate. But the Yipeng 3 is now anchored just outside Denmark, outside the coast of Denmark, and there is a Danish warship that's been following it and is now anchored nearby, keeping an eye on the Chinese ship because they think that there's probably going to be some type of criminal investigation on this. Now, the Chinese ships are responding saying, okay, we're just waiting for orders from our parent company about where to go to next. So that's their position, why they haven't moved yet. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says they don't know anything about it and they wouldn't be involved in this anyway. But even if they were involved, they would say they weren't involved in it in any way. So that doesn't really mean anything. That's what they're going to say anyway. And now the problem is because the Chinese can't necessarily be trusted because the Chinese have followed what's called gray zone tactics, which is a type of hybrid type warfare. That's where you're using non-military forces or even non-state actors to do actions on behalf of the government. So this has been found very much into the South China Sea, where the Chinese use the maritime militia and I've written about this, is where they use the maritime militia to enforce things that the Chinese government wants, such as fishermen are nearby. They'll do things like use lasers to try to blind crews of ships. They will throw explosives around where fishermen are to scare off the fish. They will chase off fishermen usually through some type of ramming tactic to these small boats. So they're all in there and they also report back to the government guys, basically eyes and ears to the Chinese government. The Chinese during their civil war, when they finally took over China in 1949, also used gray zone tactics to try to, again, maybe use civilians to instigate a reaction from, in this case, the nationalist forces, that they would the nationalist forces would resort to violence to civilians, basically people that are hired by the Chinese Communist Party to look like civilians, to create a crisis to move against their enemies. So this is kind of a revolutionary kind of view. And so the question is why the Chinese can't necessarily believe is like the Chinese government have embraced gray zone tactics, and your revolution, you've turned it, you've made it part of your security strategy. You practice it every day in the South China Sea. Why are we to believe that you somehow would not be involved in the cutting of lines, which has been identified as part of hybrid warfare, and it's on behalf of a country you support, Russia? China is one of the supporters. They say non-military aid, but they do support Russia in other aspects. So the Chinese really can't believe, because they've embraced the idea of using civilian assets on behalf of the state to do something to serve the state's interest. Okay, so that's why the Chinese can't really be believed. When you sit there and embrace these tactics, and somehow somehow you're not involved in something that could plausibly be viewed as a gray zone tactics, you've lost your deniability factor, because how can we tell what's true and what's not true? So the Chinese government has a very difficult line on this, is even if they weren't involved, they have not, because of their prior policies they adopted, can't really be trusted to be telling the truth. Again, that's the two-edged sword of when you sit there and say, it's the sky is falling, or the boy who cried wolf. At some point, people are going to stop believing you. So because of a policy that you publicly embrace. So, but the U.S. is not agreeing with the Swedes or the Finns, because they say, well, no, it doesn't look deliberate because they say they can't make a connection between the Yipeng 3 and a Chinese state asset. Now, my argument is the U.S. has its hands full in the South China Sea. Also, from the point of view, is they don't want to push Chinese closer to the Russian camp. We've already done enough. U.S. policy has already done enough to push those two together. They don't want to accuse China of committing this act and then have them use this act as a crisis to be able to justify supporting Russia more directly, providing actual flat military aid, or become a outside chance, not likely going to happen, becoming an active participant in the Ukraine war, or go ahead and run a disruption campaign in Asia to take focus away from the Ukraine war and cut back on U.S. aid to Ukraine because they're fighting or having to deploy more assets to face China in the South China Sea. The U.S. is trying to avoid that. So it could be very much, again, then that's the plausible case that it was a Chinese gray zone tactic, and that they got themselves involved in hybrid warfare. The U.S. is willing at this point to excuse the Chinese and not create a situation that they accuse the Chinese of being involved in this, because it's not in the U.S. vested interest at this time to accuse China and possibly encourage them to alter their policy around direct support to the Russians in their war effort, or again become more aggressive in the South China Sea, where the U.S. has to start directing more focus to Asia and less material aid to the Ukrainians. So I think what happened is that the Europeans will never be able to prove it was a intentional act, because I don't see the Chinese government allowing Finnish and Swedish authorities to board the Yipeng 3 to interview the crew, to gather information, to inspect the ship, to determine if this was an intentional act or not. So the Chinese were involved, and the question is this hybrid warfare? The Europeans say yes. The Chinese and the U.S. say no, but both sides have some form of, the Chinese are going to they're always going to deny it no matter what, because they don't want to make it look like they were involved as a government agency, even if they have the Yipeng 3 was acting on behalf of the Chinese government as a civilian asset. And then the U.S. has no vested interest in accusing the Chinese at this point, because they do not want to, they don't want to push the Chinese and the Russians closer together in the war in Ukraine. So that is the papers for today. I kind of took an offbeat pattern with that one, is like, with the cutting the cables and the hand wringing getting old, is that there's a lot of been policy changes inside the Ukraine war. You've obviously got first casualties, North Korean casualties in Kursk. Not sure exactly how many. It looks like some of the approvals of U.S. and later British weapons to attack targets in Russia, it seems like a lot of it's based around Kursk, the support of the Kursk operations. I did say that it was in one writing, it was in the U.S. interest to beat the hell out of the North Koreans, to basically demoralize them so significantly that when they go back to North Korea, they basically sow fear inside the North Korean military. Speculation on my behalf, but it was definitely, it would be in the interest of the West, especially the United States, to specifically target the North Koreans. So I'm not sure how much the approval of ATACMS and Storm Shadow, the British Storm Shadow cruise missile, how much of that was driven by a policy to try to basically punish Russia for bringing the North Koreans in, or to specifically punish the North Koreans by inflicting casualties on them. Unclear at this time. And then the Russians responded with the what was originally thought was an ICBM. President Putin came on the air. Can't really believe a lot of what he says, but he did say it was actually a medium-range missile, new missile that U.S. can't, their systems can't shoot down. That's probably true as far as Patriot and other systems like that, or Arrow 3, but probably THAAD could probably shoot it down if it was took a ballistic trajectory. But anyway, the more significant part of that was it was actually the first time a MIRV, multiply independent reentry vehicles, usually used, been exclusively used on ICBMs, nuclear tipped ICBMs. So it looks like the Russians used a conventional MIRV warhead. MIRVs have never been used in combat before, so this is the first combat use of MIRV. So it does look like they have it. Very curious on some of the technical issues of how they did it. I kind of have some ideas, but again, I'm not a weapons expert. I'm not a physicist or anything like that. So I have an idea of how they would do it, but I'm not going to publicly state how I think it got there. But it was pretty incredible footage to see how those weapons, how it attacked. Was, I think it was six independent reentry vehicles that also had sub munitions attached to them. So pretty impressive attack, but I think a lot of pundits and other people in the media, I don't think they realize how escalatory this is. The Russians had to give a warning to both the United States and China that they were launching this missile. They didn't give a lot of warning, but they did have to agree to it because it followed the ballistic trajectory and from a location, my understanding, from a location that is used to launch ICBMs. So they had to warn the U.S. that this was coming because they did not want the U.S. view this as a nuclear attack and go to DEFCON 2 or possibly DEFCON 1. So they didn't want to have the U.S. defense conditions read this as a nuclear attack with a ICBM being launched from a facility known for ICBMs for a weapon that Russians say, is a medium-range missile, but it followed a ballistic path. So they had to warn the U.S. and China of this. Now, President Putin gets on the airwaves and says, okay, we will warn because we're humanitarians, we will warn next time we use these missiles, we'll warn the population for them to get out of there. They have to warn everybody. They have to warn the United States and China anyway, because that's part of the agreement that they're still supporting, that so that the U.S. and China do not regard it as a nuclear attack and raise their security levels and their nuclear forces. So maybe the thing is, maybe Putin's not as crazy as that. He's at least going to notify when he's going to launch these missiles again. But again, he has to because of the possibility that it could trigger a nuclear war, or at least get you that much closer, So this is something that is highly escalatory. And they said it's in response to the use of the Storm Shadow and attacking inside Russia. So that was the response from Russia. That was the red line response. And why, again, it goes into significance because I even wrote about this book. Chinese were talking about having conventionally armed ICBMs. The issue with that is, again, it falls to the same thing that the Russians are dealing with this missile, is how does one separate that this is a nuclear attack versus a conventional attack? You can't, because of the flight profiles that are taken by these missiles. I don't know enough about the physics of it, but I do know that the flight profiles that ballistic missiles take is different. And so we have early launch detectors. We have to be able to find these radar systems, space-based and ground-based systems to be able to detect these launches. So yeah, this is really escalatory, is because at what point do they launch one of these missiles and we think, oh, okay, can you always make the assumption that that is going to be a conventionally armed missile? You're not going to be able to tell. And that in itself is escalatory, because if you've got fire on warning, or what is the thing they used to call it, is move it or lose it, is that when you got an ICBM coming in, do you launch on that, knowing that it's coming in, and you should launch your response attack, because you don't know if it's nuclear or conventional. And once it's launched, are you going to just take the Chinese or the Russian word that it's conventional? We're attacking you conventionally, but it's not nuclear, so you don't have to respond with a nuclear response of your own. Okay, how do you tell the difference? Let's say conventional armed ICBM launches and it's heading towards Washington, and the adversary country says, "Don't worry, it's conventionally armed." Do you risk that? Do you risk full decapitation of the U.S. government over the launch of a promise that it's only a conventional weapon? Yeah. So this is where it is a dramatically escalatory use of this weapon. So I'm sure we'll get more details that come up there, but it was a significant escalation that I think is highly how's the best word I can have it, is that it's underappreciated by countries that are just reporting on this, by the media sources, social media, government officials. They're really underplaying this. Again, I'm not fear-mongering into this, but you just look at it from the point of view of, again, going through the Cold War doctrines of nuclear attack is, this is a significant issue. This is a significant escalation, and it is a significant warning, because at what point do you look at that missile and say, okay, is that conventional or nuclear? And how much risk are you going to say, oh, it's conventional, we think it's conventional, yeah, please, it's conventional, and not react to it? It is a significant escalation, and brought to you by the people. And I talked about earlier how this Ukraine war has been an international disaster. This is one part of it. So that's why I've been pushing so much and writing so much about trying ideas that they need to find a way for a peaceful solution to this war. This war needs to end. And these are the policies of it. Not saying that peace is going to break out in the world once the Ukraine war is settled, because there's a lot of apprehension and there's a lot of ill feeling between the West and Russia, to a lesser extent, a slightly lesser extent, China. So there's a lot of the damage has been done, and so even if the war ends, this doesn't mean that the world goes back to January 2022. So. All right, so that is my rant and thoughts for this week. I thank you for all my supporters that have been with me, all my followers that have been with me, and welcome to all my new followers and subscribers. It is greatly appreciated. Again, it would be greatly appreciated if you could find a way to support my work. This is a relatively a low-cost operation, but I do have to pay for a lot of news information. A lot of data sources are not free, and I have to pay for them, or I have to forego getting full access to data sources because it is beyond the budget. So again, any support that you can give me would be greatly appreciated. But if you cannot give me support, if you could just pass on my work, suggest it to people, that would also be greatly appreciated. So I want to say thank you to everybody in the U.S. The next week is a holiday week, so happy holidays to everybody. Everybody else, the foreign listeners, which is about 25%. I hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for your support, and we will talk again next week. Thank you. Bye.